welcome to the ad hoc CCFO meeting. I am the chairman, Mitchell Englander. I'm joined by my esteemed colleagues, Councilmember Felipe Fuentes and Mike Bonin. Thank you very much. Good morning. With that,
Mr. Chair, it's Mr. Bonet's birthday today. I don't know if you were aware of that.
Today is in fact his birthday, and yes, applause.
And all I wanted for my birthday was no early morning committee meetings.
And since we're fashionably late, we're accommodating you on that. And for your birthday, I'll buy you a tie. All right. So with that, we'll jump right into public comment, if we could. Greg Spiegel, followed by Paul Dumont, followed by Jeff Christensen, and Autumn Elliott. If you can all come up together. And I think we might just need a couple more chairs. Are there chairs there tucked in? Fantastic. Excellent. And is Paul Dumont not present? Okay. So we'll put his name in that we reflected that we did call him up and file it as well, that he filled out a speaker's card. Seeing no other speaker cards, we'll close public comment after you three. Perfect. Okay. Thank you.
Greg Spiegel, Inner City Law Center. I didn't see till late yesterday that planning had a new report out, so I look forward to getting a chance to kind of look through that, but we haven't had enough chance to look at it yet. But so just quickly, as we use definitions to narrow what categories of housing fit in neighborhoods, which is what we're doing with the definitions of boarding house and family, we're going to limit what housing options are available. And before changing those definitions and limiting what housing options, we should have a better understanding of what our affordable housing needs are, and we suggest that that be part of this discussion. What needs do we currently have before we start redefining things and limiting what options we need? So, like the housing department and what our housing needs are need to be part of this. That started to enter the conversation as planning has put in a discussion of housing element in this report, but we think it needs to be much more involved. And then for those housing needs and the existing housing, what is working and what is not working? The definitions are going to limit whole categories of housing, good and bad. We said here, we know there are good examples of shared housing. We don't want to eliminate categories. Definitions do not distinguish between good and bad. So please, let's take a look of what are our needs, what are our current categories, what is working, what is not working, before we start talking about what the definition should be. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you. Good morning. Whoever's ready. You all. Rock, paper, scissors.
Good morning. My name is Autumn Elliott. I'm from Disability Rights California. We are the state's protection and advocacy agency for people with disabilities, and mandated by state and federal law to advocate on behalf of people with disabilities. The Planning Department report acknowledges that should the council narrow the definition of family, it may disproportionately impact folks with disabilities, and suggest as a possible remedy to that, creating a separate definition for housing for folks with disabilities. That is a very problematic concept, and I'm going to give you just one reason why. As Disability Rights California, we frequently get calls from providers of housing for folks with disabilities telling us that neighbors are threatening them, picketing them, for trying to house folks with disabilities in their neighborhood. These are folks who are housing women with developmental disabilities, folks with traumatic brain injury. I didn't realize until I did the work that I do that that's still the world we live in, that folks are afraid to have 4 women with developmental disabilities or 6 individuals with traumatic brain injuries living in the house next door. And to the extent that there is some separate definition, separate process, that paints a target on those folks' back and makes it much easier. I'll stop now because I'm running out of time, but it's a very important consideration.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Autumn.
Good morning.
Good morning. Jeff Christensen, Executive Director of the Sober Living Network. Appreciate the opportunity to share. Happy birthday, Mr. Bonin. I celebrate tomorrow. I don't have an early morning committee meeting. Specific reference, page 9 of the report about permitting community residences. I've handed out something for the record. It's an American Planning Association study that was done in 1997. And I'll read it because it says things better than I say things. Municipalities and counties throughout the nation continue to use zoning to exclude community residences from single-family residential districts despite 25 years of planning standards and the vast majority of court decisions that recognize community residences for people with disabilities as a residential use. Misconceptions about their nature and impacts abound, although there is a wealth of scientific evidence that community residences for people with disabilities generate no adverse impacts on the surrounding community and function as residential uses. More recently, the Fair Housing Amendments Act of 1988 prohibited zoning regulations of community residences that are based on unfounded myths and fears about the residents and appeared to explicitly disallow the use of special use permits as the primary means of regulating community residences. Yet this misclassification and exclusion continues unabated throughout most of the nation. That was 15 years ago. If you go down to the findings, community residences are a residential use of land. For zoning purposes, community residences are much closer in terms of land use to a residence ordinarily occupied by a conventional family than any other land use. The majority of courts have ruled that community residences is the opposite of an institution, boarding house, or a commercial use. Number 2, community residences have no effect on the value of neighborhood properties. More than 50 reference studies in this report have examined their impact on property values more than for any other small land use. All researchers have discovered that group homes do not affect property values of even the property next door. And 3, community residents have no effect on neighborhood safety. Everything is here in this with a reference to the full report.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. Okay, that will conclude public comment. If I can ask the Planning Department to please have a seat at the table. I do want to address some of the, just quickly, ideas, concerns, thoughts, and suggestions that were brought up. And I think this committee has done a pretty good job of articulating from the beginning that, and I'd be remiss if I didn't introduce my colleague also who joined us, Mr. Price. Thank you very much. Good morning. The committee has really looked at and shared collectively and individually our thoughts on, and I think recognizing the fact that we do have to have some definitions that are antiquated and outdated while balancing and ensuring we protect housing, in fact making and creating more of an opportunity for those needs. And they are well documented and well studied and what our needs are. And we need more of them. And we need more opportunities for those with developmental disabilities, all types of disabilities, veteran housing, shared housing, community housing, group homes, but then creating and striking that balance to ensure the ones that that what we will call or label not the good operators, the bad operators, if you will, some way of, and we've heard from building and safety, we've heard and gone into a deep dive of the issues, the problems, case law, housing law, making sure that we protect and include and cast a wide net to ensure we do that. All residents and folks equally across the board and ensure more opportunities, in fact, not less. And so not being restrictive, but more inclusive. And with that, though, then having the ability to, quite frankly, go after those that are those bad operators. And it's not just about, quite frankly, the property values of protecting the character of neighborhoods, but those most vulnerable in society who are being warehoused in those dwellings that don't have any either supervision or standards of living, quality of care. In fact, just the opposite. they're neglected, oftentimes emotionally and even physically abused. They're put at risk in safety. And so those are the ones we want to protect as well. And getting to a path of creating the definitions and then balancing that with an opportunity that if they do fall within those definitions, from what we've heard, we've already gotten into a deep dive on what is a licensed facility, what's an unlicensed facility, what we have authority over and what we don't, looking at best practices across municipalities throughout Los Angeles and including and being inclusive of and caring for those federal housing laws as well as the best cases cited in the court. And looking at all of that and saying, okay, we've got to come up with definitions but then have a path for those that fall within those various definitions where they don't have to have a complicated or expensive, but just the opposite, an easy, streamlined process that's cost-efficient and effective to them to get permitted, whatever that permit means, to ensure that those folks are cared for properly as well. And so I think if that sums it up, unless my colleagues want to add anything to that, we'll go into the latest planning report. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And if you could, walk us through your latest report and what was asked for. And I think we'll have some direction coming out of hopefully today's committee and various requests back on how we move forward with this discussion on single-family housing unit as well as the boarding or rooming home and the community residence and how that would play into that idea and concept of a community residence and what that means.
Good morning, members of the committee. Alan Bell, Deputy Director of the Planning Department. For the record, and with me is Matt Glesney, Planning Department staff. At the last committee meeting, the instruction was to do a survey of other communities across the state to see what their approaches are to these issues. So we did a survey of 14 jurisdictions, both large and small, all across California, to see how they defined family, to see how they defined boarding or rooming house, or to see how they defined a single housekeeping unit. Clearly, the definitions are foundational to the policy that the council would want to take with respect to community care facilities and group homes. So getting the definitions right is very important in terms of trying to identify a permitting path or regulatory path. That is the foundation for the ordinance are these definitions, and how one approaches those definitions. There are there are policy implications for any particular definition that would be identified. So with that, I just want to turn it over to Matt to provide the results of our survey to see how LA stacks up against other jurisdictions across the state.
Thank you. Matt Glesney, Department of City Planning. As Alan said, we looked at 14 cities. Just to recap a little bit, we did get into a bit of this discussion last week, but there are some new council members here. We began with the discussion of family and the very closely related concept of a single housekeeping unit that is sort of used as a proxy for family by many communities in California. We kind of mentioned it last time, but now we sort of have the proof that our current definition of family, developed in 2006, is probably the most permissive definition of family that we came across in the across cities, and that's because it only requires a group to have common access to sort of common areas, like the living areas and the kitchen areas, the shared sort of middle areas. If you have shared access to a living space, you are a family currently in the city of Los Angeles, and that sort of trumps every other. You can't be a boarding house, you can't be a hotel if you're a family. So that's why it's so important, that definition of family. We mentioned on one hand that's very good, it provides shared housing opportunities. On the other hand, it prevents enforcement challenges when you're trying to differentiate a legitimate family from something closer to a boarding and rooming house. And so we began with a proposal where we left off at City Council in January 2013 with a proposed definition of single housekeeping unit. It can be found on page 7 of your report. We went through that last time. We mentioned that, and looking at the other cities now, it's clear that the first 3 new kind of markers or characteristics that we would include in a new definition of single housekeeping unit are fairly widespread, are found sort of in the mainstream, are the most common. When you look at our listing of the markers, the top 3 in that list on page 3, those are the most common markers, including sharing household activities and responsibilities, including meals and chores and expenses, being an interactive group of people, and being non-transient or relatively permanent. Those markers are common. You can see there's a number of, most of the cities have something very similar to that or exactly that kind of language, so those are sort of within the mainstream of other cities. There is a 4th definition, a 4th marker in the proposal, that the makeup would be determined, the makeup of the household has to be determined by the members of the household themselves and not a third party like a landlord. That is perhaps a little more controversial out on the edge. We didn't see any other city that had that except for Newport Beach, where we sort of got that from, and Newport Beach is under a legal cloud right now with that definition. So there was some discussion last time of if we do want to proceed with something like that, there are some positives to an approach like that in terms of enforceability, but you would likely, and we'd probably recommend, a sort of carve-out for persons with disabilities, and that's where that community residence idea comes through at the end of our report, that you'd sort of tighten it, but then you'd have a relief valve, particularly for persons with disabilities. If we don't have that, then that may not be needed in our initial analysis. But I don't know if we want to stop there and just and focus in on single housekeeping unit again with the full council members here and see what we think about what we've got. We could talk about a lot of the other markers. There's some decent ideas in there that could be added or replace that 4th marker, but we wanted to probably open it up to you and have a discussion.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to my colleagues for any questions or comments, unless they want to dive into community residence and what's being proposed or suggested in language there. But
I got a question. I'm sorry, I haven't had a chance to read the report yet. It came out yesterday, and I'm actually having trouble loading it here. But here's my question, and I imagine that what I'm asking was beyond the scope of the original inquiry. You looked at how many different cities?
14.
14. Is there any information on when those definitions went into effect and what impact the implementation of those definitions had on the availability of affordable housing in those cities?
It's a great question, but we did not. It's very difficult. Many, looking online, they don't say. I think code does say that, but many other codes don't say that, and we did not track that information to know when they came into effect. It's clear that some are a little older and maybe a little more old-fashioned, and maybe before some court decisions it seemed that way, but we don't have a clear listing, and therefore it's difficult to know, and then to do the further research to know exact impacts. In fact, I think it's difficult even to try to predict in our own city what the exact precise impacts of a lot of these definitions are, how much, what sort of impact that would be on enforcement and on the protection of our single-family neighborhoods. I think it's in some ways you can make a guess. We tried in our report to at least quantify the numbers in terms of how many shared housing units we think are out there in Los Angeles. We did look at how many group quarters. We did a survey of Craigslist to find how prevalent is shared housing out there, mm-hmm. And it's basically 1 out of every 3 or 4 units for rent is a shared kind of arrangement, a bedroom arrangement. So we know the number's large, but it's hard to say each particular marker what particular impact that would have. It's a difficult conversation.
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting information point, but part of what I was asking about is some of the context. Maybe folks from the Inner City Law Center or some of the affordable housing advocates can submit something for the record. I'm sure they have some info. The other thing that's sort of a relevant context to it is what procedures different cities have for addressing nuisance properties, because that's also sort of part of the context. And I'm sure that's impossible to gather through an internet search and stuff like that. But
I think that idea of enforcement and nuisance is sort of the other side of the coin, and we'd be happy to do a deep dive on that aspect of this, because I think that is an important part of this whole discussion, but it probably is a separate discussion, a separate report. Yeah.
Thanks, Matt.
that's why in looking at in striking the balance, if I could, in looking at what new definitions would do, and I think looking at the fact that ours were last written when?
Sorry?
Our definitions were last updated when?
Our family was 2006, boarding house
Right.
1956.
1956. Well, those are the ones we're really focused on, but the 1956. So with that, any update in any type of definitions on what we're narrowing in on in terms of those types of properties that are being operated as facilities, not so much homes, and actually further encouraging shared housing and making it more available for people in every zone, and looking at those opportunities. But in those situations that are considered boarding homes, if you will, or not servicing the disabled population either, but really looking at it as a business model and cloaking themselves into something else, it falls into, if they're not licensed and they fall into those categories, and if we have the definitions, then what is it, how do we balance that with getting them the ability to operate without having to go through some cumbersome, expensive conditional use process or zoning variance? And then, but balancing that with, on the enforcement side, is if we do have some type of process, whether it's police permit review, something that would be simple over the counter, would then allow also fire inspections and things like that, wellness checks, that we'd then have the ability that if they didn't follow those rules of operation, if you will, there's new enforcement tools that go along with, for example, the 24 different categories we have under police permit review, that you could have new conditions set forth on those particular properties if they're nuisance, if you will, or if they're not following the rules. You could have a possible revocation hearing in front of panels that if they're not following those new conditions. But again, those are going after those nuisance properties. And so that's where the definitions end up getting us. And then on the flip side, not bundling them all into just one or two different definitions, but at least a palette of 3 or 4 different types of opportunities. So we allow, in fact, more housing for those that aren't licensed facilities in the state of California to operate. So that's that balance we're looking for.
Yeah, and the thing I want to be sensitive to is we're looking at the definition of family through the prism of this one issue, and I want to make sure that if we're going to update the city's definition from the 1950s, that we think about what the other implications might be on the range of issues that the city deals with in building and housing and stuff like that. And knowing that as we look at other cities, Los Angeles is a fundamentally different city than a lot of others. We have significantly more poverty than many of the other cities that I presume have been surveyed, much larger immigrant populations with different family dynamics. God knows, back in the 1950s, my relationship didn't meet the legal standards of families, although it probably might have met this code. But so I want to make sure we're sensitive to all of that as well.
Mm-hmm. And then again, yes. So we've got Oakland, we've got others in here that have a lot of similar conditions. But Mr. Price.
Yeah,
Good point.
Just want to say, please, I am be a part of this committee in this discussion. It's really, I think, fundamental. I think we should be trying to see how we can create more housing opportunities, how we make that more possible and not restrictive. And so I think ordinances like this are important. And the ultimate, obviously, it depends on the definition. And so that's it's an inclusive process. I've got a series of questions, in fact, Mr. Chairman, from the inner city laws I'd like to pass on that may or may not be addressed in our deliberations, but I think it's very helpful to gather as much information as possible so that we can, again, see how we can expand and permit a variety of housing configurations, and that's important.
Excellent. Thank you.
If I could just ask a couple questions about the report. So the report speaks to the definitions here, and then you offer an optional shared housing definition with persons with disabilities. There was some testimony and public comment here that spoke to the potential of this being a problem for us. Can you help me understand why it is that the report it seems like it offers 2 definitions. One for shared housing, and it hinges around the single housekeeping unit philosophy, and I understand why it does that. And then you say that there's an optional. Why do we have an option? Shouldn't we just have one that captures both?
I think that it's important to view the definition of community residence, or potential definition of community residence, only in terms of how we would define single housekeeping unit. So I think our basic conclusion is if we have a restrictive definition of a single housekeeping unit that includes the 4 markers that are included in the current proposal from over a year ago, in particular the 4th marker where you're self-selecting, that is an outlier. The self-selecting option was only included in Newport Beach. None of the other communities that we surveyed had that kind of a strict particular marker. So our analysis leads us to the conclusion that if we wanted to have that more restrictive definition of single housekeeping unit, that would have an impact on shared housing. That would have an impact on co-housing opportunities. And then to mitigate those impacts of that more restrictive definition of family, we think it would be advisable to have a definition of a community residence. Depending upon the definition of family and single housekeeping unit, if it's not as restrictive as currently as proposed, then a community residence option may not be necessary.
I see. So, I guess that's a good signal to us that sort of continuing on the previous definition or the proposed one that we're speaking to is rife with peril given sort of what, I forget the city that's dealing with the 4th marker in litigation right now. Newport Beach. And so is there any sense as to what the outcome of that litigation is going to be, or timeline at least?
They lost they won their first case, but it went to the 9th Circuit. And this is a case basically determined can the case go to a full trial.
Who lost?
City of Newport Beach was sued for their new definition of single housekeeping unit, which included those marker, the 4th marker, and the judge called out that marker as one of the potentially problematic. But it hasn't gone to full jury to fully say it's been discriminatory, but a judge found enough evidence that a jury could reasonably conclude it was discriminatory, so it's continuing would go to full trial on the facts. But we'd probably defer to our city attorney's office to describe it in more detail if you'd like.
I mean, that's an important consideration. I mean, clearly, I think what's more important, I think, is that in terms of how California cities in general, regardless of whether that's a legal approach or not a legal approach, setting that aside for now, clearly that 4th marker is an outlier, and that is the results of the survey indicate that it is an outlier. So to the extent that other communities, how their approach that they have taken, if we wanted to be more in the mainstream of other California jurisdictions, the first 3 markers that fairly sits in the mainstream in terms of how other jurisdictions are approaching it, and in terms of our public testimony and public comments, that 4th marker seemed to elicit the most concern as far as its impact on shared housing.
Sure.
There might be.
If I could real quick.
I've got another point, Mr. Englander.
Yeah,
and so, and I'm wondering if we're not coming at this from sort of the wrong, I shouldn't say wrong, but I wonder if there isn't another perspective that we should be sort of looking at this, because it seems that if we're trying to adjust that definition, then we have to add a corollary to make sure that we're not in trouble with the disability sort of community. I'm wondering if we shouldn't be sort of bifurcating the conversation to look at sort of commercial operations and making a distinction between setting aside family and the single housekeeping unit principle for a second. If we shouldn't just sort of identify what a commercial operation is, both profit and nonprofit, and see if we need to sort of look in that area as opposed to trying to find definitions for shared housing and family, et cetera, et cetera. It seems to me that by and large, the problems that we've heard about aren't necessarily coming out of that area. It's about, as Mr. Englander has said repeatedly now, about bad operators. And to me, that almost necessitates a conversation of looking at this from a commercial perspective. So understanding that 6 and fewer probably don't, irrespective of whether they're commercial or not, well, they would have to be commercial because they're licensed care facilities. Everything north of 6 units or 6 people maybe that's where we should be looking as opposed to trying to redo all of this. I'm just wondering if you have an opinion, or I don't remember seeing anything here that sort of speaks to the commercial component of all of this.
Well, that gets to the definition of boarding house. So again, we have our definition from 1956. We did survey other communities in terms of how they define a boarding house, and so Matt has some results I think that he can report in terms of how other communities are approaching that. But that gets at the issue is what's a commercial rooming or boarding house.
And so just before you answer sort of boarding house, I mean, I in my college years rented out rooms to make the mortgage. I would not consider myself a commercial operation, but it was probably some type of boarding house situation. So I would want to refine it so that if you're operating more than one facility, more than one sort of housing, that is a commercial. Anything that necessitates or should necessitate licensure and business tax, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, to me, that seems to be what ought to be sort of the threshold here. I don't know that we want to start considering Felipe Fuentes renting out 2 rooms at a bargain, great landlord, sort of the sort of boarding house. I don't know that we should capture those folks because then it speaks to the whole shared housing problem.
Yeah, I think we've spent a fair amount of time looking at that idea because that seems logical. This idea of a commercial establishment, you're just making money versus a true sort of family. It's tough to draw the line of what is a commercial establishment. I think any rental is technically in the eyes of a city a commercial establishment, and so where do you and the courts have sort of ruled that it's less about how they got there and the arrangement. It's more about how they function together.
Is it any more difficult to define commercial than it is to define family, though?
But again, I mean, perhaps you could come up with something creative, but I think when we tried to get at that, that's actually what the fourth marker tries to get at is this idea that if you're self-selecting, the business is not saying who's going to go there, you're selecting. So that was our attempt to get there, but like any time you get close to that, it has potential impacts on the greater, and so it's hard to find that line.
And I know Mr. Englander want to take back control here, so my last sort of suggestion, how about if we look at any sort of agreement with a renter, habitant, if you exceed 6 sort of units or 6 rooms. So, you define that as commercial. So if you have more than 6 agreements with people, that then becomes a commercial operation, thereby sort of getting away from the 6 and fewer sort of situation.
Yeah.
And we'll define that as, so if you have an 8-bedroom house and you're renting out 7 bedrooms, then you're a commercial operation. If you have the 4-bedroom house and you're renting out 3, you're not commercial.
So that's where boarding house comes in. So the idea with boarding house, and let me just address your issue. You mentioned license of 6 or more. Licensed of 6 or more under the current proposal would be treated sort of separately. The 6 renters are by right as family. The 7 or more would be treated differently and undergo a sort of performance standard review for licensed, and then you have those facilities that should be licensed, and then there's a separate enforcement procedure for that. But the idea of boarding house, maybe it's time. The boarding house is what gets in the idea of how many rooms are you renting out, and so currently the definition of boarding house from 1956, we found to be quite strict. Actually, we found it right now 1 guest room for rent for occupancy. You're considered a boarding house in the city of Los Angeles, and we did find that on the more strict side. When you look at other cities, the most common threshold we found is 3 or more guest rooms for rent. Then you become a boarding house. Was the most? Some had 4. I think 1 maybe had 2, but 3 seemed to be the sort of the standard. And the Attorney General had weighed in on that and said that is an appropriate approach. So that line can be drawn at guest rooms. It's more difficult to draw a line with people because we do have a court decision that says families can be unlimited. People, but this idea you can separate into rooms or single housekeeping units, separate families, separate housekeeping units, or separate guest rooms. And again, so what we've heard from the committee members is this idea that we do want to encourage small scale sharing of housing. This may be a way to do it if you follow the lead of the majority of cities to change current from 1 in your boarding house to the idea of 3. Your boarding house, and then you'd de facto be saying you're allowed to rent out 1 or 2 rooms and not be a boarding house. And if we wanted to make that explicit in the zoning code, not just that you're not a boarding house, but that you are explicitly allowed in a dwelling unit, then we'd recommend also changing the definition of dwelling unit to say that you can be a family, a housekeeping unit, plus 1 or 2 bedrooms for rent, or the council could set a threshold in terms of the appropriate number of rooms. But I think that's where you're headed, is this idea of, yes, once you reach a certain critical mass of rentals, you're something other than just something that belongs in a single-family unit.
So a couple things on that. One is we looked at that last time extensively and exhaustively as well, and it was there was a consensus from most of the folks that are here today, in fact, and participate often, that they don't want a number of leases, and it wasn't, we had the long discussions about limiting it to a single lease and anything more than one lease, and we got into a number of leases and said, okay, leases is really not the direction. We want to be much more liberal, and that was certainly what we heard from Intercity Law and many others, that we don't want to differentiate between the number of leases being, getting into a commercial area versus not. We're trying to avoid that and have more participation in available housing rather than trying to narrow it just to simply the number of leases. But I really wanted to speak also to one of the things on the decision in Newport, and I think it's important to share the full history of that, if I could, for a moment. I've actually read the case. The reason Newport won the case is that their definitions were withstanding and meeting fair housing. That wasn't the issue of why they lost on the appeal. From what the judge said, it was all the discussions leading up to the legislative decision in being discriminatory as well, and that they actually narrowed in on that they wanted to, in fact, take that direction of, if you will, discrimination, of not being inclusive. And it was all their public comments, their private comments to the press. It was all of the documentation leading up to it, and the judge went very thoroughly and did a great job, I think, in looking at all of that beyond just what they passed in a definition. And so the court actually speaks to that if you read the full case. And I think that needs to be said, and we have to understand that. Having said that, I do think still, though, that compromise and not going as far as what they did, and looking at some of the opportunities and suggestions you've made, what I'd like to do for the next meeting, if we could, is a couple things. Based on the conversation and the input that we've had from the public as well, is to come up with those 3 or 4 changes and definitions for suggestions by the planning department and what we would actually consider out of this body. It wouldn't be a consideration for an actual vote, but for the final report coming out of this committee. I think from what I'm hearing is there's a general consensus that we've got to update some of these definitions. Where we go with it and how we implement them and how we adopt them is a discussion we've got to take. But I think there's a consensus of, okay, we do need to update some definitions. What are they going to mean? How are they going to be applied? Is the discussion we'll take once we get to what would some of those definitions be. Having said that, I think 2 of the other things we've got to do. One is one of the things Councilmember Bonin brought up. Let's look at what other municipalities have done with enforcement. How have they been able to or not been able to enforce what rules they do have? If we've got 14 other municipalities that we've looked at that have actually updated and changed their definitions, what do they do for enforcement and how do they enforce? So I think that was your question. So we'll look at that and probably ask Building and Safety to help participate with that study as well. And then finally, what I'd like to see come back to this committee is what opportunities would housing folks have to, if they fell into adopted definitions that went beyond by right in any zone, whether that's single family, commercial, or otherwise, or multi. What opportunities would they have to be able to operate? What path or process could they take? What options are there? Whether it's a variance, conditional use permit, police permit, what options, creating a new type of permit, and then I think we need to have a discussion on each one of those to narrow in on what's the path of least resistance, what's the most efficient and effective, what's the most cost effective for those operators to continue. And we're talking about the ones that fall out of licensed facilities within the state of California. Again, the ones that are not by right, but would be affected by new definitions, and then though what's the process for, looking at the enforcement parts of it, but also then finding that path to ensuring they not only continue to operate but allow more to operate, and be liberal with that, but having some type of permitting, easy permitting process, or let's do an inventory of what options we have in our tool belt, and so we can have that discussion. Anything that my colleagues would like to add for those three items coming back?
Not for those three.
Or any others? It is your birthday.
Something I asked about a few weeks ago is, or one of the previous meetings, is, I'm trying to articulate this as I'm sitting here. I come at this from wanting to deal with the nuisance properties. And particularly if this is a field where there's potential risk of litigation if we don't do things properly. I'd like to get something from Building and Safety or LAPD that can tell us, to the extent that they know, how much of their nuisance property complaints are related to shared housing, or how much of shared housing are nuisance properties.
So we've asked for that. Every division, unfortunately, tracks it a little differently, which is an issue that we've had from day one. It's not something that if you will, that's been CompStat. It hasn't been a CompStat issue where LAPD actually tracks. There was domestic call, there was this type of nuisance call, whatever that is. We do know with certainty from the ones that we've surveyed that those problem properties are chronic for call-outs from both LAPD and, by the way, I would add LA Fire to that as well.
Right.
And there are numerous calls, but they're not tracked by that's a boarding home or that's a licensed or an unlicensed facility. They don't capture any of that information within LAPD or LA Fire. Building and Safety, depending on what they filed on, it could be trash, it could be loud noise, it could be all types of other issues. It could be the way that the property is built out without permits. And so it's tracked also a little differently. It's not CompStatted in any of the various departments that way. And so it's very difficult to
I'm wondering
if
if there's anybody who can give us a sense, though, of how much the problem is with shared housing versus houses that constantly rent themselves out as film sets versus absentee landlords or something like that, so that we get a sense of what percentage of the nuisance property problem we're addressing through this one.
I can only speak anecdotally, but the experience that I've had in working on the task force for the last 13 years that we established, and working with the county probation, LAPD, LA Fire, City Attorney's Office, numerous stakeholders, our experience has been, and for the San Fernando Valley, and certainly working and listening and hearing about a lot of other communities, not just in Los Angeles, but throughout the region in California that we've spoken to as well, is that the majority of these problems aren't the ones with that are chronic film homes that are filming. In fact, most of those, they're really easy to shut down if they don't have a permit for filming, and if they do have a permit and they're not adhering to the conditions of the permit, it's easy to work with Film LA and others not to issue any other permits or have additional conditions put on those properties for those chronic problems that are doing homes that are doing filming. So we haven't seen that issue there. The absentee landlord situation, we've got a huge housing stock of absentee landlords. That hasn't really been the issue just because we have a landlord living out of town. We see that more with brush clearance issues, certainly in public safety and things of that nature, but not the chronic type of homes. A lot of the nonprofits, a lot of the good organizations that operate boarding care facilities and disabled and veteran housing, we really haven't seen or experienced a tremendous problem with any of those. In fact, they are welcome neighbors and have been, for the most part, the super majority of them, it would be the exception to the rule where they have any problems whatsoever. It's the ones that, and it's not the ones that fall into the ones that just don't have the ability to get licensed in California, and they have 6 or fewer but they're not operating and providing the specific services that would require a license, those aren't the ones we're necessarily having a problem with. The ones we seem to have the biggest problem with, and there's a proliferation of these, are the ones that are cloaking themselves in things that they're not, calling them themselves one thing and not providing any service whatsoever, not actually either renting out, basically essentially running themselves as mini hotels. They advertise rooms by the day, by the month, cash basis. There's no programs, work programs, transitional programs, shared program. There's no counseling. There's nothing whatsoever. There's simply, really, for the most part, boarding homes that are warehousing people for money, and oftentimes have 20, 30, 40 people in them. And we have a lot of these types of properties but it's going after them and saying, well, you're calling yourself one thing, but you're actually not fitting in any definition of what you're calling yourselves. And I don't want to narrow out any one particular type of group and call something out for purposes of this discussion, but they'll say they're one thing, but they're really doing nothing but charging a bed fee. And oftentimes we'll have 5 to 10 people in a room in deplorable living conditions that don't even meet living standards. We have no access to them. We've had many problems in enforcement and door knocking and having allowance to get in. We've had all types of crimes committed and even murders, arson, fires, all types of drug and alcohol. I've never run into, just as an example, any program or housing program that calls themselves Sober Living, and the Sober Living Network attests to this, that allows alcohol and drugs on the premises to be used freely, and saying it's part of their rehabilitation, that if they choose to continue to use drugs, at least they're off the street. And there's very strict conditions that for those who follow at least basic pillars of programs don't allow chronic drug use, and it's simply not tolerable in the facilities. And while somebody slips, or if you will, to use the correct terminology, and they get off their sobriety for a moment, that's one thing. But allowing continued use and having kegs of beer, for example, in a sober living home is not something that they can really call themselves sober living. Having no access ramps for disabled and no ability for them to use the facilities or get in and out of the shower, and calling themselves a disabled home. Those are things that are regulated. And so those are the ones that we do have the chronic problems, the ones that call themselves something that they're not. It's not the people like Felipe Fuentes, who rents out multiple rooms to pay his college rent. In college, yes, not anymore.
I was just wondering if there's a way we can get a department that can quantify for us what percentage that is of shared housing, or what percentage our nuisance properties that is of our nuisance properties.
And that's been the challenge, is because the ones that are the nuisance properties that are not licensed are not cataloged as such, because there's no permitting process to say that here's how many have been violated their permit, which is what brings us here today. So if we can look at exploring that, I'll add that to the agenda and see if we have a way of perhaps getting from building and safety or the police department how many problems, if they've got some type of inventory of issues that they've done, that would be helpful. So let's see if we can work with PD, fire, and building and safety to see if we can look at that universe and come back with then those 4 suggestions. And I think that will we're getting the hook here. So with that, we are adjourned. Oh, and I would add to that, before we voted on the adjournment. Now there's a motion to adjourn. We are adjourned. Without objection, we are adjourned.